Right, so I was born in Melbourne, in outer Melbourne, in a rural area, and then I went to primary school in a state school in Croydon, which was out the suburb, and moved to a private school in the inner eastern suburbs, so into a middle class area, and then eventually into the inner Carlton, more or less like the glebe of Melbourne, when I first went to Melbourne University and became more politically conscious, I suppose. That was in the late 60s, early 70s. So really I had a middle class upbringing in many respects. My mother was a librarian. She encouraged me to read and write and so on. So although I started studying science at university, I fairly soon moved over into the humanities. Like I said, it became more politically conscious around that time, towards the end of the Vietnam War.
It took me a while to learn that, but basically that Melbourne had a kind of progressive association, and Sydney, you growing up had that conscience that Melbourne was progressive and Sydney not much?
I didn't really have that consciousness then. I mean, I've looked at it since then. I think the basis of it was really that Melbourne was the centre of industry and Sydney was a trading financial centre, and so Sydney was seen as a bit more Americanised, a bit more materialistic perhaps, and Melbourne had stronger trade unions, or the trade unions were more left oriented than in Sydney. Still to this day, I suppose, the Labor Party and the trade unions in Sydney are more dominated by right wing politics, and in Melbourne there was this, until at least the early 70s, this manufacturing base and a greater history of trade union militancy.
So what, do you remember the first times or substantial time spent at any inner west location? Well, what is the inner west? Newtown, Leichhardt, Marrickville, Balmain. Was already this association to the inner west as progressive?
I guess I came to the inner west. I came to live in several places in Newtown in the mid-70s, in 75, 76. I was in Melbourne and different places before that. I suppose I had a sense of Newtown as in a cultural sense back in the mid-70s. And for example, I was with an Indian spiritual group, but we had a social magazine which was printed in a print shop run by a Spanish man, which still exists in King Street, Newtown. And we started to develop some links with some people at the University of Sydney. There was a more left side to academia at Sydney University back at that time, which later on I joined myself, but not till the late 90s.
Was already, besides being progressive, was it cheaper? There was already some form of gentrification. What about diversity?
Yeah, I guess it was a working class area back at that time, Newtown. It's obviously become more gentrified since then, or more expensive, more middle class. But it was working class, and there were a lot more migrant communities there, and visible on the street.
So we're in the early 70s, and did you have an awareness of Latin American politics? Were you aware at the moment of for example, the 1973 coup?
Yes, I was aware of the coup in Chile. In fact, I do recall even the assassination of Che Guevara in the late 60s. All of this in the context of the Vietnam War period, which was very influential on me. I think I was influenced actually by my first real strong political influence was probably the campaign against capital punishment here when the last man was hanged in Victoria in 1966. I was very young then, but I recognise now that was an important part of my political upbringing. But the Vietnam War, of course, had a big influence on most people in my generation, one way or the other. In the later years, in my last year at school, I think in 1970, I went on one of the biggest demonstrations there, and then there were some other demonstrations the following year in 1971 when I was at university, where I actually ended up being a witness in court for some demonstrators who were arrested. So and there was a lot of activity on campus itself, protecting the draft resistors and so on. So that was influential. But in the context of all that, of course, I was reading, and becoming aware of political discussion around the world, and Latin American affairs and the Cuban Revolution were very important in that. Obviously, Che Guevara was deeply associated with the Cuban Revolution.
So by 1967, well, you were around 14. Do you have any memory of like people talking about it in the newspapers with the?
Yes, there were. I mean, there were newsletters also on campus. There were publications by left groups on campus in relation to the war and linking the war to resistance in other parts of the world, particularly in Latin America. As I say, the Cuban Revolution was such a landmark event that influenced left thinkers at that time. It popped up in discussions all over the place. You know, the image of Che Guevara also was just ubiquitous. You know, that young radicals at university then, as now, would wear the image of Che.